So imagine you're an archaeologist 2,000 years in the future. You know there is this very important cultural thing called Star Wars. People quote it, reference it, and it's often used as a broad cultural shorthand to communicate ideas. There were a number of movies and other formats that came together to tell a story that enthralled entire generations. However, you have two movies, the second season of a television show, a pile of comics and novels, and a lot of movie reviews, some summaries, and arguments over the various movies and shows. That's the same situation we're in when it comes to the Trojan epic cycle. Hi, my name's Garvin. I review books, and today I'll be talking about the Lost Epics. So let's get started on that. The Iliad and the Odyssey are two epics out of eight, and the others didn't make it to us intact. I should mention it's not just the Trojan epic. There's an entire Lost Theban cycle, from what I understand, and there's the Gigantomachy, which is basically the sequel to the Titanomachy. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here, but I want you to understand that the myths and stories we do have are just pieces of a vast shared universe, of which there was more than one version, as the myths told in Sparta or Thebes would have been different than the ones told in Athens. The ones we have are mostly Athenian because, unlike the Spartans, for example, the Athenians wrote their crap down. Let that be a lesson to you people. If you don't write it down, it never really happened. Write it down. ah, anyways, you're likely asking how we lost these epics in the first place. Well, it's a combination of two things, a lack of interest and budget cuts. See, these are oral traditions copied on papyrus scroll by hand, later transcribed over to vellum and then paper. The Iliad and the Odyssey were the most popular works and got recopied a lot. Even then, in the medieval era, they were lost to Western Europe and only saved in the Byzantium Empire. Other epics, for various reasons, weren't as popular, so they didn't have as many copies made, and the times were often unfriendly to written works. So each copy lost is harder to replace. Meanwhile, the number of people who could copy the works in the first place, already a small group, was shrinking, and there's only so many funds to go around. The moral of the story here is the local library needs a bigger budget, kid. What we do know of the Lost Epics comes from a lot of places, though. Plays written in Athens, scenes painted on pottery, references buried in other works, and various fragments. There are two major summaries as well, the Chrystomony of Proclus and the Post-Homoerotica of Quintus of Smyrna. Both of these were written in the Roman Empire in 2nd and 3rd century AD, which is a long time after classical Greece, which was already a long time after the events of the epics. So what you're looking at is fourth to fifth hand accounts at best. I'm not going to go into detail about the two summaries because I'm not an expert in this field, and others have already given way more information on them than I ever could. Instead, I'm just going to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of each missing epic instead, and then we'll kind of go from there in future videos. The Kypria combines the prologue of the Trojan War with the opening years and covers the longest period of time, partly because it also takes about 5 to 9 years for the Greeks to even get their fleets and armies together and go to Troy. It's here we see a lot of stuff that we consider part of the story, but is never actually explicitly said in the Iliad, like the judgment of Paris, actually getting the armies together, that kind of stuff. Interestingly, this also gives a completely different origin for Helen and goes a lot into Paris's life before the war. It also has Paris and Helen having children together, which doesn't show up in the Iliad. There's also a possible meetup between Achilles and Helen. The Cypria ends right before the Iliad, where Achilles captures the young lady that ends up being the subject of dispute between him and Agamemnon. The Iliad takes place after this, and I won't go into it other than you should read it. I mean, Achilles fights a whole damn river and wins in this story, guys. With Achilles gone, the Ethiopians show up led by Memnon, who might be the most awesome character I know nothing about. He's the son of a Trojan prince who was kidnapped by the goddess of the dawn and raised in Ethiopia. And he shows up to kill Greeks and chew bubblegum, but bubblegum hasn't been invented yet. He then proceeds to tear apart Greek troops as if they were made up of tissue paper before a newly purified Achilles shows up. And after being warned that after he kills Memnon, he's next, Achilles shows no hesitation in murdering this guy. Have you noticed how Achilles just basically kills everyone? No wonder everyone thought he was immortal, right? Well, at the funeral for Memnon, his mom shows up to beg Zeus for resurrection, but Achilles' mom shows up and wants immortality for Achilles. Achilles loses that argument, and at the end of this epic, Paris kills Achilles at the very. The next epic is called the Iliad, which is a terrible name, but I didn't name it. It starts with an argument over who gets Achilles' armor and weapons, since he doesn't need them anymore. Now, Odysseus and Ajax were the ones who retrieved his body, so they get to be the lead contenders. Odysseus wins and Ajax commits suicide. Paris also dies at the hand of the man who inherited Heracles' bow and armor. Helen's forcibly remarried for about 5 minutes, and the epic ends with a version of the fall of Troy, with Achilles' son Neoptolemus showing up and being utterly terrifying. He literally beats King Priam to death with the body of a full grown man at the age of like 15. Odysseus, on the other hand, saves the guy who hosted him when he was a diplomat. So there's at least one nice thing that happens in this epic. Then we have the sack of Troy, which mostly agrees with the events of the Little Iliad, but adds some darker details here and there because I guess we need those. Like Ajax the Lesser, there were two, like Sith, you see, tearing a screaming and crying Cassandra from the altar of Athena. Nice. As well as the sacrifice of a Trojan princess at the grave of Achilles, because that's fun. There are also several versions of Helen's fate here, but the most popular being that the Greeks or Menelaus themselves were going to kill her, but in response she tears off her clothes and everyone's rendered so powerless in the face of how hot she is that no one can bring themselves to lift their hands against her, which I guess is one way to get out of trouble if you can. The Nostoi is basically the epilogue of the war. It tells the story of the return of the Greeks, most of whom are going to meet tragic ends, as the Greek fleet is hit with a massive storm as it's leaving Troy. This is portrayed as a punishment for their behavior during the sack. For example, Athena, who's been one of the more pro Greek gods during all of this, ends up actively calling for Zeus to punish them. Now, not everyone's covered in this story. Odysseus gets his own epic in the Odyssey, which is a pretty good story in its own right, but functions more as a sequel to the Trojan War, if you ask me, because it's a complete story that just happens to take place after the end of the war. So, not quite an epilogue, honestly, in my point of view, but you tell me. The absolute last epic is Telegony, which covers Odysseus's death at the hands of his own illegitimate son and the aftermath. There are several different, wildly different versions from what I can track down, so I'm going to leave this one alone for right now. Like I said, these aren't the only lost epics, but it gives you an idea of how little we actually know about mythology from the past. Below, you'll find some links that I used for sources, as well as a link to my Patreon, where you can join my Everwise patrons for as little as $1 a month. and my book reviews where there's 7 years of written content to look at. Now, those Everwise patrons have voted, and for some reason, they would like the follow up video to be the ever cheerful issue of child abandonment in ancient Greece. So that's coming up next, and I hope to see you there. Please leave a comment or a like if I entertained you, and stay safe out there.